President of Iceland, Minister Tan, Excellencies, Alice Rogoff, I think my travel to Singapore was worth just meeting you because I've heard so much about you in Alaska, and thank you for your commitment to the Arctic. Friends, when I heard the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore speaking, I just looked at my notes and thought, well, I don't need to say anything. Because I think he really pointed out the most important, on a macro level, important questions in these discussions. To look at the international legal framework for the Arctic and also the political cooperation supporting this framework. As a small country, Norway and Singapore share the same commitment on this international framework. And in my presentation, I will try not to add in a more not so sophisticated way what the Deputy Prime Minister said, and also what my the previous speaker said about developments in the Arctic Council. So thank you for that very good briefing. I will focus, and I just want to assure you, President Grimson, that in the Arctic Council there is a commitment from all Arctic states to involve all the observers. And there is a consensus that we need the observers, competence and technology. And I think most of the 8 Arctic states involve bilaterally with observers, working with observers. So I'm so happy to confirm to you that there is a willingness and a need to engage with observers. My most important, what I'm going to say now is of course the most important, and that is to congratulate Singapore with the Golden Jubilee. That is my most important task here. And I wanted to show my presentation, start my presentation with a photo of the Fram expedition, 1893 to 96. As you may remember, this was the exhibition, exploration, the Amundsen, Nansen and Johansen crossing Greenland. And they hardly made it back to Norway. They learned a lot from indigenous peoples in Greenland and the Sami population. So Arctic exploration, building technology and developing technology is nothing new 10, 15 years ago. It started already in the 18th centuries. They made it back to Norway. They became rock stars at that time. And as you all remember, and that's why I'm mentioning this as an appreciation to Singapore, the Norwegian independence in 1905 was very clearly connected to the polar heroes. So congratulations, Singapore. And I will continue the other side. When we talk about the Arctic, there is a tendency to talk about one Arctic. So the Norwegian perspective is very much that there is no one Arctic. There is not one size fits all when it comes to investments, when it comes to involvement, when it comes to indigenous peoples. So this is a definition, or different definitions. I have got this from the Arctic Council's AMAP report. As you can see, there are different definitions: the high Arctic, low Arctic, subarctic, and I would also one definition including the temperature in the ocean, the sea area. There's also maybe one simpler definition, and that's the North American Arctic, European Arctic, and the Russian Arctic. These kind of intervene a little bit. But there are tremendous differences when it comes to these different regions of the Arctic. And I'm sure, Alice Rogoff, with your experience from Alaska, economic development in Alaska, I think it would be interesting for you to see the Norwegian Arctic. 10% of the Norwegian population live in the Arctic. A small, or 10% of this, is indigenous peoples. Most are coastal people. We have had oil and gas, offshore petroleum in the Barents Sea since the beginning of the 80s. We have huge fisheries managed in cooperation with Russia very successfully since the Cold War. We have increasingly economic activity, fisheries, also other types of industry moving from the south to the north. There is a higher economic growth in the north compared to the south. So the Arctic in the Norwegian context is not a poor area where we need to involve. The Arctic is a strong voice in Norwegian policy and really framing the Arctic policy. It's important to be aware of these different concepts of the Arctic, because sometimes there is a feeling that the Arctic is looked upon as kind of far away up north. We look at it, it's the start of the world. So we have lived in the Arctic 10,000 of years, and I think we really need to focus not on having people, politicians, companies, whatever, coming to the north rescuing us. We can rescue ourselves, but we would like to work with all of you, with observers, in a framework which is regulated by democratic Arctic states. So what is the reason for this higher activity in the European Arctic? Iceland, Norway, part of Russia, as you can see, Finland and Sweden. Well, it's not because we are so much more clever. It's because the temperature is quite different, and it also affects shipping, of course. So with the red lines, you can see the currents, the Gulf Stream, the Atlantic currents coming from the Gulf of Mexico, all along the coast of Norway, up to Iceland, and even up to Svalbard. And in this area, you will see a lot of economic activities, because there are no ice during the wintertime, there's no permafrost on the mainland, there's no polar bears, even though in the tourist magazines we like to put a polar bear or two to attract tourists. There are polar bears on Svalbard. So it's important to have, when you talk about new regimes of shipping, of investments, of corporate social responsibility, to be aware it's not one Arctic, it's different types of Arctic. And we, the Arctic states, we would like to have this knowledge that our friends have this knowledge on the different types of the Arctic. So how is the situation when it comes to shipping in the Arctic today? Because we feel sometimes there is a hype. There was a hype on race for resources in 2006, 2007 that led the Arctic states to work very closely to confirm the legal framework, the UN law of the sea. And there are no disputes today when it comes to the legal framework for the Arctic, also regulating shipping with the International Maritime Organization too. So how is the picture when it comes to the shipping in the Arctic? So this is from 2011, 2010 and 2011. I have this slide from one of the reports from the Arctic Council about a proposal to to identify sensitive areas in the ocean and to establish shipping routes. The Arctic Council and the senior Arctic officials felt there was no need to establish a special shipping routes because the shipping at that time, and this is 4 years ago, was very limited. So most of the shipping, and you will see on the photo, the slide, that the yellow color is the Arctic Basin, the Arctic Ocean, and the gray, you see Greenland, Alaska, Canada, Iceland, Norway, Russia. You will see that most of 80% of the shipping in the summertime are through Norwegian waters. It's connected to destinations in the Arctic, mostly connected to what I mentioned previously, offshore oil and gas activities. So there's very, very limited shipping outside kind of the area around Svalbard. In the winter time, of course, shipping is less, but still it's significant that the shipping in the Arctic today is connected to economic activity. And when it comes to cruise ships, there was a working group in the Arctic Council just recently, very focused from Canada and United States. For Norway, it's not so relevant because we have 100,000 tourists to the high Arctic every year, 50,000 on cruise ships, and I think this is reflected on this slide. So this is not to kind of tell you the story about shipping in the Arctic because you have more competence than me, but it is to have a reality check on the situation today. I had a question from my journalist yesterday and said, "Oh, this is terrible with these Arctic and new shipping routes and Singapore, and what are we going to do when the Arctic is going to take over?" And I said, Singapore can just relax. It will take years, many, many years, if ever, that the Arctic shipping routes will compete with the present routes. But anyway, we need Singapore's commitment to technology development, to safe operations, and to cooperation in the Arctic Council. So, what are the kind of key objectives on a macro level for Norway? And I will not, I think the Deputy Prime Minister really touched upon this in a very good way. Of course, the most important for people living in the Arctic and for the Arctic states is to keep this region peacefully and stable. That's the most important. And for this reason, we need institutions, we need legal frameworks, we need a framework where disputes can be solved. And we feel, and I think I can talk on behalf of the senior Arctic officials all, that we feel today we have this framework. So peace and stability is, of course, the most important for increased economic development and for shipping. Sometimes we have a tendency, at least in Norway, to look at the details and not look at the political important framework. The next objective for Norway is to I'm mixed up in my is to balance the economic activities in the ocean with an ecosystem-based management. And I think this is a principle for a country where we have a lot of different economic activities. We have extensively, as I showed you, shipping in the Arctic, we have fisheries, we have fish farming, and we have offshore oil and gas. So we have, with Russia, in cooperation with our good neighbor Russia, we have made a special shipping lane, a route along the coast of Norway, so the big ships do not come close to land to prevent oil spill and to keep the shipping route away from the most sensitive areas. This has been reported to the International Maritime Organization. But to keep, in order to have a transparency, we have initiated a database where you can all access. It's named Barents Watch, and you will find all the activities going on in all the Norwegian oceans. You will find where oil installations are, most sensitive fishing areas, and also the shipping areas, the shipping routes. We would like, because we think it's important to have transparency, to have not only people like us, but also media and others to have access to this information on our ocean, especially when we look at increased traffic. And I had to show this photo of the law of the sea. All Norwegian diplomats need to know about the law of the sea. It's like a Bible for us. Since the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore really underlined the importance of the law of the sea for small maritime nations, the importance of having a predictable framework, international framework. I will not go more into the importance of the law of the sea. I will just echo Singapore, and just to reflect that observer countries and Arctic states can have the same focus on the legal framework. So I will end my presentation with just a brief slide of the Arctic Council, the blue members, the light blue observers. The Arctic Council, as mentioned by the President and by Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister, and also by the previous speaker, is the only political cooperation among Arctic states and involving very important observers. As I said, there is a consensus among the Arctic states to involve observers. 3 weeks ago in Alaska, observers spoke at the senior Arctic official meeting for the first time. Sometimes there is a discussion among people that, and especially people that seem to be very efficient, that the Arctic Council is a little bit slow because it's consensus oriented and we discuss too much. And yes, being Norway's representative to the Arctic Council and being a diplomat, I must say it was a culture shock for me to start working in the Arctic Council, because we have the 6 indigenous organizations at the table. And I think to work with the indigenous organizations have really been the most important learning curve in my diplomatic career. It is about talking, explaining things, not voting, but reaching consensus, and reaching consensus in the way we all can agree. And it's important to note that in the Arctic Council, I work as closely with my Russian colleague as I do with my Swedish colleague. There is not a special North American group, Canada and United States, a Russia-Norway group, a Nordic group, an Iceland group. We shift according to different interests. But it's interesting to note, and I'm just referring to the map I showed you first, that the interest of the Arctic states are not so much defined, of course, defined by politics, but also defined by geography and economic development and geographic factors. So next year, the Arctic Council will celebrate the 20th anniversary. Today, it's the only fora where we have this on a governmental level, where we have this regular cooperation with Russia as we used to. So, and I think it's important to underline, it's really important to build this political consensus among Arctic states and among observer states and other observers from civil society and international organizations to reach a peaceful cooperation in the Arctic. Thank you. And I think I just end by saying thank you to Singapore and to all representatives from observer states that are here. We need your commitment, we need your knowledge, but we also need your views to shape the future of the Arctic Council. Thank you.